They don't warn you about the wait. Nobody sits you down on your first day in an emergency room and tells you that every patient you lose is going to take something from you that you are never getting back. Nobody tells you that the job doesn't stay at the job. That it follows you home, sits in the silence, lives behind your eyes, and slowly, quietly, over years and decades, it hollows you out from the inside until there is almost nothing left. And that is exactly what the Pitt Season 2 has been showing us all along. Not just a doctor doing his job, but a man being consumed by it. And in the finale, we finally saw what that consumption looks like when it reaches its absolute limit. There is a version of Robbie's story that looks, on the surface, like success. He is experienced. He is respected. He has spent decades in one of the most demanding environments that exists in medicine, and he is still standing. Still showing up. Still fighting for every single patient that comes through those doors. And if you only looked at the surface, you might think that this is a man who has it together. That the years have made him stronger. That the experience has made him better. But the Pitt Season 2 finale did something that very few shows are willing to do. It peeled back every single layer of that surface and showed us what was actually underneath. And what was underneath was not strength. It was exhaustion so deep that it had become indistinguishable from the man himself. From the very first episode of this season, something felt different about Robbie. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle in the way that real pain usually is. It sat behind his eyes. It lived in the pauses between his words. It was in the way he moved through a shift like a man who was running on something that wasn't quite fuel anymore. Something that was closer to habit, closer to the muscle memory of a person who had been doing this for so long that stopping felt more dangerous than. From the very first episode of this season, something felt different about Robbie. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle in the way that real pain usually is. It sat behind his eyes. It lived in the pauses between his words. It was in the way he moved through a shift like a man who was running on something that wasn't quite fuel anymore. Something that was closer to habit. Closer to the muscle memory of a person who had been doing this for so long that stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. And as the weeks went on and the episodes built on each other, that feeling got heavier. It got harder to ignore. Until the finale arrived and made it impossible to look away from. What this episode did so effectively was connect the dots in a way that recontextualized everything we had seen before it. Because this wasn't a man who had suddenly cracked under the pressure of one bad shift. This was a man who had been cracking, slowly and silently, for years. Maybe decades. Every patient he had lost. Every death he had witnessed. Every impossible decision he had made in the middle of a chaos that never stopped coming. All of it had been adding to a weight that he had never once put down. Never once allowed himself to process. Because in that emergency room, there was no time for that. There was never any time for that. The next patient was always coming. The next crisis was always arriving. And Robbie, being who he is, was always going to be the one standing at the front of it. And that is the thing about people like Robbie. The ones who are the strongest in the room are very often the ones who are the most skilled at hiding how close to the edge they actually are. Because their strength becomes the expectation. It becomes the thing that everyone around them relies on. And so they keep performing it. They keep showing up and holding it together and carrying the weight because that is what they have always done and they do not know how to be anything else. But here is the truth that this finale forced us to sit with. Strength performed for long enough without ever being replenished is not strength anymore. It is survival. And survival has a cost that eventually comes due. The episode made that cost impossible to ignore. And the closer we got to that final scene, the clearer it became that Robbie had been paying that cost for a very long time. The question that the finale left hanging in the air was not whether he had reached his limit. It was what happens to a man when he finally admits that he has. And the answer to that question was something that nobody in that audience was fully prepared for. Think about what it actually means to have no life outside of your work. Not in the way that people casually say it when they are busy or stressed. But truly, genuinely, in the deepest sense of the phrase. To wake up and have nowhere to be except that building. To come home to silence so complete that going back to the chaos of the ER actually feels like relief. To have spent so many years pouring yourself into a place and into people that somewhere along the way you forgot to build anything else. Forgot to maintain the relationships, the hobbies, the version of yourself that existed before the scrubs and the fluorescent lights and the constant noise of a place where everything is always on the verge of falling apart. That is Robbie's life. And this finale made us look at it directly. In his conversation with Dr. Mohan, Robbie opened up in a way that felt almost uncomfortable to watch. Because he wasn't performing vulnerability. He wasn't giving a speech. He was just telling the truth quietly, the way people do when they have been carrying something for so long that they are too tired to dress it up anymore. He said that his life didn't go the direction he thought it would. That he imagined being married by now. He thought he'd have kids in college. He pictured a whole existence outside of those hospital walls. A home that felt like a home. People who were his in a way that patients and colleagues never quite can be. And instead, there he was. Alone. With nothing but the work. Now some people might hear that and think it sounds like a small sadness. A quiet regret. The kind of thing that a lot of people feel when life doesn't match the picture they had in their head. But it is so much bigger than that when you understand the full weight of what the emergency room took from him. Because it wasn't just that life passed him by while he was busy working. It is that the work became a substitute for all of it. The patients became his family. The staff became his closest relationships. The ER became the only place where he felt like he belonged, like he had a purpose, like he was something more than just a man sitting alone in a quiet apartment with nothing but his own thoughts for company. And when the thing that gives you purpose is also the thing that is destroying you, you are trapped in a way that is very difficult to explain to someone who hasn't felt it. Because you cannot walk away from it. Walking away from it would mean walking away from the only thing that makes you feel like yourself. But staying means continuing to let it take from you. Piece by piece. Shift by shift. Year after year. It is not a choice between something good and something bad. It is a choice between two kinds of pain. And Robbie, for as long as we have known him, has always chosen the pain that at least comes with a sense of purpose. But what the finale showed us is that even that is starting to fail him. That the purpose is no longer enough to outweigh the cost. That the emergency room that he gave everything to has taken so much from him that there is barely anything left to give. And the most heartbreaking part of all of it is that he built this prison himself. Brick by brick. Shift by shift. Every time he chose the hospital over everything else. Every time he let a relationship fade because There is a line that Robbie said in this episode that I have not been able to stop thinking about since the moment it left his mouth. He said that a part of you dies when someone that you love dies. It was said quietly. Almost in passing. The way that people sometimes say the most devastating things as if they are just observations rather than confessions. But when you sit with those words and you apply them to the reality of what Robbie's career has actually looked like, the weight of what he said becomes almost unbearable. Because Robbie has not lost one person. He has not lost 10. He has spent decades in an emergency room where death is not an exception. It is a daily reality. It is a colleague. It is the thing waiting in the next bay, behind the next curtain, on the other end of the next call. And every single time that death wins, every single time that a patient doesn't make it despite everything he did and everything he gave, a part of him goes with them. That is what he told us. And if you believe him, and after this season I absolutely do, then the question becomes a terrifying one. How many parts of yourself can you lose before there is nothing left? The case with Judith in this episode was one of the most viscerally tense sequences this show has ever constructed. A mother who had been following a free birth plan came in with preeclampsia and the situation deteriorated fast. And throughout every single moment of that sequence, the camera kept returning to Robbie. Kept finding his face through the glass, through the window, in the background of shots where he technically didn't need to be. And what you saw on his face was not the composed professionalism of a doctor who has seen it all before. It was something rawer than that. It was the face of a man who was holding his breath because he could not afford to lose this one. Not today. Not on top of everything else that he was already carrying. And when the baby was finally breathing and Judith was stable, the exhale that moved through him was so physical, so total, that it looked less like relief and more like a man releasing something he had been holding for years. That moment said something important about the cumulative nature of what working in emergency medicine actually does to a person. It is not just the losses that break you. It is the constant anticipation of loss. The state of permanent readiness for the worst. The fact that you can never fully relax. Never fully exhale. Because the moment you do, something else arrives and demands everything you have all over again. Dr. Javadi touched on this in the episode when she spoke about how mentally and emotionally drained she already felt this early in her career. And I want you to really sit with that. Because if someone who is relatively new to the ER is already feeling that level of depletion, then what does 20, 25, 30 years of it actually look like inside a person? What does it do to the parts of you that were never meant to absorb that much? The grief, the adrenaline, the helplessness, the responsibility, the impossible decisions made in seconds with lives hanging in the balance. All of it, every day, with no real place to put it and no real time to process it before the next crisis arrives. Robbie has been absorbing all of that for longer than most people can even imagine. And the finale showed us the result of that absorption with a clarity that was at times genuinely difficult to sit with. Because the scariest thing wasn't that he was breaking. The scariest thing was how long he had clearly been broken without anyone, including himself, fully allowing themselves to see it. Not every important moment in a finale arrives with dramatic music and a close-up shot designed to tell you that what you are watching matters. Sometimes the most important moments are the quiet ones. The ones that happen in a corridor or a side room. Throughout the shift, Robbie had been avoiding Langdon. And the reasons for that avoidance were written all over him even if he never said them out loud. Because having that conversation meant confronting something that Robbie had been running from. It meant looking at himself honestly and acknowledging that he had failed. Not in a small, professional, easily correctable way. But in a deeply personal way. Langdon had struggled under his watch. Had reached a point where the weight of working in that environment had pushed him towards a darkness that Robbie, for all his years of experience and all his supposed ability to read people, had either missed or chosen not to see clearly enough. And that kind of failure sits differently on a man like Robbie. Because he holds everyone around him to an almost impossible standard. He expects precision and excellence and complete dedication because that is what he has always demanded of himself. And when something goes wrong with someone under his care, it does not feel like a professional oversight. It feels like a personal indictment. It feels like evidence of a crack in the version of himself that he has spent decades carefully constructing and maintaining. So when Langdon finally called him out on the avoidance,